Good evening. This is 2020 Church, and I'm Pastor Larry Enriquez. You know, we're here in the start of summer and going through the Gospel of Mark, and it just feels right. We're here in Mark chapter 8, but before we get to the meat of what we're going to talk about here in chapter 8, I want to go back and reflect a little bit of what happened in chapter 6 and 7. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but Chapter 6, we have the feeding of the 5,000 men, who most likely were men who were of the pro-rebellion against Rome men. And Jesus feeds those 5,000 men. And then they want to make him king, and so he flees those guys. And then we have in chapter 7, that was chapter 6, we have a movement by which Jesus leaves essentially the work he's doing among the Jews, specifically in Jerusalem and those areas, and moves outside of that. And he moves up into the place we might call Syria, or today Lebanon or Beirut. And in that area is this place called Tyre, back in the ancient days. And there we find the faith of a Syrophoenician woman, a Syrian woman. And we find the Lord moving outside of that, and the healing of a deaf man and a mute man. Then we come here to Mark chapter 8, where we'll have another feeding, but of 4,000. And this is probably greater than 4,000 because it's a mixed crowd. But let's get to that in just a minute. Let me read you something of this portion of Mark chapter 8. During those days, another large crowd gathered. What days? The days when he left Jerusalem and he's in the area outside of what's primarily Jewish. He's now ministering to the Gentile as well. It says that during those days, he's still being followed by a large crowd of people. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance." Think about this just for a second, the backdrop and the meat of what's happening. This place of the life of Jesus, he has a following of 4,000 plus people. Do you have a following of 4,000 people? I don't mean likes. I mean people who are gathering in person in the flesh to hear what you have to say. This is Jesus. So that people are leaving their homes, their environments, their work to go see Jesus. I'm not sure we can imagine the gravity of the pull of Christ during that day. And what would drive people to see somebody? I mean, I like going to concerts. I don't go to that many, but I like going to hear somebody that I like. But I've got to really work at it because the price of the tickets, the place where the concert might be, driving there, as I get older, all that gets weary. Parking, walking, crowds of people to hear, fill in the blank. Let alone go hear somebody talk. I'm amazed that people come hear me preach on Sundays. I'm grateful that God has given me an audience, not for my sake, but they're willing to come and hear his word through such a flawed person. But Jesus, in this case, for instance, there's 4,000 people. They've been following him for days, and they really don't even know who he is. It's important because Jesus make some proclamations that give us insight into the reality that Even those closest to him don't get him. Think about that for a second. Thousands of people are following Jesus for days at a time. There are no amplifications, computers. There aren't 7-Elevens on various corners if at least you can go get a big gulp. There isn't anything like that. But they are following Jesus because he's someone to behold. They're desiring him. Now, I think that ultimately, if you desire Jesus enough, you'll find the Jesus. Now, unfortunately, sometimes we're looking for the Jesus we want him to be. And that's okay, because once you find out he's not the Jesus you want him to be, then you'll leave and you'll never be a true disciple. But eventually, when we find Jesus, even though we might be pursuing a wrong sense of who Jesus might be, when we see him and come to him, we begin the journey of discovering who the real Christ is. And he's greater than we could ever imagine. But these people are drawn to pursue who he might be. And ultimately in this life, all people are being drawn by something deeper, and ultimately only Christ can fulfill that. People pursue all kinds of things, some good, some not so good. But all of them, should they supersede Christ, will only be idols in their various forms and leave you empty. But here, as they follow Jesus, not knowing who he is, and I've got to add this, only Jesus really knew who he was. His disciples hadn't even got it yet, and these people don't get it. They're following him because he's performing signs and miracles. There are wonderful things happening, but they don't get it. They just know that there's something in the core of them. I'm assuming this, that there's something in the core of them that propels them to pursue who Christ might be. But they don't know who he is. His disciples don't know who he is. And so in that regard, Christ is alone. I'm not alone here. I think all of you can say this. I feel misunderstood. Anytime there's conflict in my life, I always think they don't know me, or so-and-so doesn't know me like they think they do, and or maybe they do. They just don't like what I am. But it's not fun to feel misunderstood, and sometimes life feels lonely. And I think Jesus had this aloneness. Did he feel lonely? I don't know, but he was alone. The Father was always with him. And so he had that companionship. But in his form of God taking on flesh, he was made to have this connection too. And I believe in that regard, he had a loneliness. That's my Larryism, I guess. But this is Jesus. So they've already been with him 3 days, he proclaims. And in verse 3, he says, if I send them away or home hungry, they're so not being nourished and without water that some of these people will die. Now let's think again about this idea that they're following Jesus to hear him. Their curiosity is so piqued that they're putting their lives in jeopardy to go follow this Jesus, to try to get who he is. Again, I don't even like going to concerts because of the crowds. And this is Christ. And then it says that he has, and from this word compassion in the Greek, and even in the Hebrew too, when they use this word, it's about the inner, how do I say it in our language other than compassion? I've tried to say this before, but it's our inner organs We sometimes go, I feel my anxiety in my gut, in my stomach. Well, from that same region comes our anxieties, or we sense them. We sense our joys that tend to be in the bowels of the human. And out of these bowels of Christ, he has feelings, compassion for these who are trying to discern who he is. And he says, we can't let them go. I have this for them. His disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? Now remember, they've been with Jesus for a while, and Jesus says, I'm here. I'm the bread of life. There's always a way when the bread of life is here, but they seem to bypass that, or for whatever reason, they don't acknowledge that. They still don't get who he is. Where are we going to get enough bread? And how many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. I've done a lot more with less than that. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. And they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them, and also had told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. They didn't just all get a little morsel and go, gosh, I wish I had more. They were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present. After he had sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. It's kind of like they still didn't know who he was, but what a compassionate God we serve, that even in this place of Christ in the flesh, with deep compassion, he feeds them, that ultimately they might see the truth of this particular miracle, or what I might say, sign that's pointing to who Jesus is. That if you follow him, he will meet the longing of what your heart really longs for. And that is only what God can give. Why you're here. What's worth pursuing. When they're pursuing Jesus, yeah, some of them want to be delivered from the iron claws of the Roman Empire and maybe some other things that are going on in their lives. But we're outside here of Jerusalem. We have primarily, I believe, a non-Jewish group that are pursuing him. They're longing for meaning and for purpose, and they're looking at Jesus, who may give them that, I believe. And I think people don't realize that that's what they're looking for. They're looking for the ooh and the ah. They're looking to be delivered from their moment, or their moments of suffering or heartache or discomfort. But Jesus came for more than the moment change or need to change or the need to be comforted. Jesus came to fulfill the longing of a heart that needs to be saved and will be restless only until it finds its place in Christ. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. Now remember, there's this religious group that are following wherever he goes. To catch him, they're so mesmerized by his life, by his words, by his miracles. And he does this, and then they get him, and they They're just trying to find out who he is, but there's always this behind the scene dislike for Jesus because he's going to disrupt their business, their way, their distortion, which they believe is truth. They don't want anybody interrupting their way. But Jesus came to be the way, but they want their way. And so he sighs deeply. Here's the sighing Christ. I try to practice breathing in through my nose, out through my mouth. Sometimes a family member might go, "How come you're sighing?" Well, I sigh, I hope intentionally, because I want to breathe properly. And sometimes when I'm a little anxious or not aware of my thoughts, that I might be holding my breath and allowing my body to reach some kind of anxious mode. So I practice sighing. Jesus is sighing because of the compassion he has and the care he has for a people who still don't get it. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. Now, we're going to close with this next little section because it's just the reality of our environment, our culture, the things that we listen to. I know people who know Jesus, who are anti-Trump supporters. That's up to them, that's fine. But sometimes they say things that are so demonic, they're not even close to the Christian breath of wanting death for a politician. I say that because it's like we sometimes just don't get it. As we leave this place where Jesus is ministering in the way that he is, he now talks about influence. And I say this because whatever hose we're drinking from to gain our information, and sometimes that information is there to change your worldview, if we're not careful, we'll be so influenced that we can, again, not what political party or person you're after, but we become so slighted that our character becomes so influenced that we can become bad and unkind and unchristlike in the way that we think, in the way that we speak, in the way that we act. Here's what Jesus says. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. And Jesus says, "Be careful." Jesus warned them. He said, "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." They discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread?" Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" He goes, after all that's done, you still have the mind of the Pharisees or the inability to really see clearly because you're so influenced by the culture of the religious movement. How influential a culture can be on how we think how we make sense of the things around us. We look around with the same judgments of the world. We look around with the same negativity of the world. We look around with the same slight hand of the world clothed in Christianity. But we're called to be different. Jesus says, do you see who I am? Do you see that I'm the bread of life and that I provide and that I'm what people are looking for? And when they're broken, when they're off, when they're in need, they're really wanting and needing me. Let's not get caught up and get lost in the real essence of life and what humans need and what they're ultimately longing for. Know the power of God, the presence of God, the perspective of God, and not be so influenced like the movement of a culture, whatever that culture may be, in its political realm, in its realm as to what it calls important or valuable, in the culture that tells you what's meaningful or what's significant or what gives you worth. Because you see, yeast is an organism that changes from one cell to the next. And yeast is a good thing. I like yeast. I love the smell of yeast in dough and breads. I'm going to make sourdough soon. I just was getting out my sourdough pan given to me for my birthday, I think, well, for Father's Day. I want to make sourdough bread. I love the smell of yeast and fermentations and all. But in the Bible, the metaphor is negative because of the way that it grows and the way that it influences and the way that it propels and makes something that it's a part of completely engulfed in its cellular computations developed by the yeast. That sin is like yeast, and it begins to just make us more like the culture if we're not careful. So he tells his disciples, don't you get it? Let me read this little part to you. Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I did this and I did that? And he's saying that to us. Don't you know who I am? So why do you live in such stress? Why do you live in such fear? Why do you live in such complaint? Why do you live in such disarray? Why do you live in such confusion? Fill in the blank. Whatever your negativity is. Christ is enough. Be loved in him, love him in return, and say, Lord, why? Not as to why you're in the place you are, but why in the sense of, am I here to do your bidding or not? To say, I am here in whatever place of life you're in. For what purpose? To do God's will. To be Christ's hands and feet. See, as you long for him, pursue him. Pursue him with all that you have. Just like they did. Well, I hope this is instructive. Hope you can get back to Mark chapter 8 and read it. And I hope that this gives you some color to what you're reading. That you might be moved by the truth of God's word. Well, God bless you. Go in peace. I hope to see you this Sunday at church before we go to camp. See you this Sunday. Go in peace.